Welcome to the How Stories Work show, where I'm going to talk a little bit about Temple of Doom and what we can learn from a storytelling perspective from what we see in Temple of Doom. Now, Temple of Doom, as if you were watching the rest of this show, which you can watch over on the Orange Grove 55 channel, where we do the Story Geek show and dig deeper into the material for Temple of Doom, you will know that Temple of Doom does not rank as highly for most people. It's not true of everybody. There's some Temple of Doom fans out there that like Temple of Doom the best, but it oftentimes does not rate as highly or rank as highly with folks comparative to Raiders of the Lost Ark and The Last Crusade. I think that there are some very distinct lessons that we can learn from that as we compare Temple of Doom to Raiders and to The Last Crusade, and what those movies do maybe a little bit better to approach a wider audience. So let's talk about some of those things. But the first thing I want to talk about is actually doubling down on a comment that I made in the last show where we talked about the storytelling secrets and lessons of the screenplay from Raiders of the Lost Ark. So I did that with Michael Gordon. And one of the things I noted on that show was how impeccably paced and how Steven Spielberg and his editing team and his directing team and the storytelling team, including George Lucas, how they constantly ramp up the stakes and how they constantly drive for better pacing. And we can see that in Temple of Doom as well. And so you can tell because we're going to start out the film. So I'm going to use two sequences to showcase what I'm talking about. We start out the film and we go, where are we and what exactly is going on? We're in an Indiana Jones movie, but why in the world are we in a musical number? And yet, as soon as Indiana Jones enters into that scene, the tension is incredibly palpable. And so we have conflict. Indiana Jones wants something, and the people who want and Lao Che and his goons, basically the organized crime goons he's got with him, they want something from Indy, and Indy wants something from them, and they're going to do an exchange. But neither one of them trust each other. And this ramps up slowly over the course of time. We learn that Indiana Jones has somebody on the inside. We learn that these guys have guns. We learn that Lao Che is not going to deal with Indy in the same way that Indy was expecting. It's not going to be an easy transaction. Indy takes Willie hostage at one point in time, and then the big fight breaks out in terms of the whole club. And so one of the things that I think we can learn from a storytelling standpoint is similar to what I was talking about last week, is that we can continually up the stakes and continually make the lead characters objective more difficult for them to accomplish. The same thing happens later in the film with Dre talked about it on the show, on the Story Geek show, but Dre talked about the scene where we all loved it, where the spikes are coming down on Indy and Short Round, and Willie has to come into and go through the bugs and navigate the bugs and then pull the lever so that it will release and they can get out of the chamber and not die. And you'll notice how even in that sequence, Steven Spielberg is constantly upping the tension, constantly upping the stakes, and that is paced incredibly well. So from the moment that Indiana Jones and Short Round get trapped in there to the moment that they have to rely on Willie to get them out, it is this incredibly artfully directed and executed sequence, excellently edited as well, where we see the characters constantly face a new problem. So they'll do one thing and it works out. They'll do another thing and it makes the situation worse. They'll do one thing and it works out. They'll do something else and they take two steps back and make the situation worse. That is what I'm talking about when I'm talking about conflict and talking about pacing, is that the hero tries to face something. Instead of winning right away, they face another challenge, and then they overcome that challenge, but it presents two new challenges that may be even more difficult for them to overcome. That is fantastic storytelling, and it's for sure likely to keep the audience on the edge of their seats. So I think that works really, really well. The thing about Temple of Doom that I will personally say doesn't work as well for me, look, I love Indiana Jones. This is a 9 out of 10, in my opinion. 10 out of 10 for Raiders, probably a 9.75 for The Last Crusade. I take a point off for Temple of Doom. Primarily, I take that point off because of some of the elements that I find beyond the suspension of disbelief. And so there's this concept that we know of, that we all know, called the suspension of, is the audience able to suspend their disbelief? Now, the interesting thing about that is that suspending disbelief, meaning, by the way, if you don't know what that means, suspending disbelief just means our ability to say, I'm willing to believe what's going on in front of me, whether I'm reading it or whether I'm watching it on screen. I'm willing to believe that what is happening on screen would happen I could see it feasibly happening in real life, or I'm willing to go along with it at least, even though it may not happen in real life. I'm able to go along with it without being sucked out of the story. Because as soon as I don't believe what's going on screen, it's harder for me to engage. What's essentially happening there is that we are placing our emotions on what we're visibly and audibly receiving. When we're not able to suspend our disbelief, it takes us emotionally out of the tension and puts us in a place of observation going, okay, that's ridiculous, right? And by the way, cartoons use that effect all the time for comedy purposes, right? Because we don't believe that the cartoons are real, and so they can hit themselves over the head with a hammer, hit somebody else over the head with a hammer, and we don't sit in our seats going, what a horrendous thing that Mickey Mouse just did. He hit someone over the head with a hammer. No, we think it's funny instead, right? So occasionally, things that would suspend our disbelief can actually be used as humor, and it actually might work better than if it was used as a real life thing that's supposed to be happening. And so as I mentioned, we'll talk about this when we get to Kingdom of the Crystal Skull 2, I imagine. But there are certain things that happen in Indiana Jones that are definitely unbelievable. Now, the question is, how much are we able to suspend our disbelief and go along for the ride? Because it would be easy for us to disbelieve and to turn off our engagement. But how much are the storytellers able to counteract our thought process about doing that to keep us engaged in the film? And there are a couple places in Temple of Doom. There are no places in Raiders of the Lost Ark where that happens to me. I stay engaged throughout the entire film, no matter how quote-unquote ridiculous it gets. I think that Raiders is a slightly more grounded film. I mean, saying it's a grounded film, adventure films aren't necessarily grounded, but it feels more grounded than does Temple of Doom to me. And I think a lot of people share that feeling. So, like, for example, I'll give you a perfect example. When they jump out of the plane and they let the raft expand, part of what goes on in my brain is there's no way that raft falls out of the sky without tipping over and just dumping them out. So it then becomes, to me, a little bit suspect that would happen. It also feels a little bit so far out of the realm of possibility that it starts to feel cheesy to me. Now, are there other things they could have done to get out of that sequence? Sure, they could have jumped out of the sequence. Let's just take this, for example. Let's say that they jumped out of the airplane, they threw a raft down, and they had some sort of parachute-like thing that would have caught the air, and they kind of parachute down, and then one of them falls into the raft, and then the others have to run and jump into the raft as it's sliding down the hill. I probably could have gone along with that. Would it suspend my disbelief? It depends on how you execute that sequence, but I would have gone along with that a little bit more than the physics of watching that raft do that thing. It takes my suspension of disbelief, it takes it away, and it's harder for me to stay in the emotions that they're trying to present to me on the screen. How far can you push the suspension of disbelief? And the first problem you have on your hands is that every audience member's suspension of disbelief is going to take place at a different. I mean, some people are going to be okay with the raft sequence. Some people are not going to be okay with the raft sequence. Some people are not going to be okay with anything ridiculous happening in a film. So as a storyteller, you have to be comfortable saying, I think that this is a really good thing to do, so I'm just going to do it. Now, the tone of your movie, how serious the movie is, how ridiculous the movie is, all of that will matter into your audience's suspension of disbelief. I don't have any problem believing in a time machine in Back to the Future, because Back to the Future to me is a fairly ridiculous premise in film. I love Back to the Future. It is one of the other films that I would say is a 10 out of 10. But at the same time I would say that, I would also tell you that it is hard to believe that a DeLorean could time travel using plutonium. But that is not supposed to be this super serious film, so I'm able to suspend my disbelief. So the tone that you're setting matters as to whether or not I'm going to believe what's happening on screen. Temple of Doom is a little bit more ridiculous setting in its tone. And I think some of that is just maybe personal preference that I don't like. And so it's harder for me to suspend my disbelief when that happens. The second thing I think we can learn about comparing Temple of Doom to Raiders of the Lost Ark is that I think that the character of Willie, I think, is intended to be a comedic foil for Indiana Jones. What do I mean by that? I mean, he's going to have to worry about her as much as he's worrying about the other things that unfold. Now, from a storytelling standpoint, that does one good thing, and that means that just like with Short Round, Indy now doesn't only have to worry about himself, he has to worry about someone else as well, which then increases the stakes, increases the conflict. So that part's good. I think, though, that Willie's behavior is... Dre said in the show, she maintains that behavior throughout, and we can imagine that someone who falls into her persona might show up in those situations and do some of the same things that she does. So yes, that's probably true. But I do think that they take it a little bit too far in several places, and it makes me, again, it takes me out of it a little bit because I go, oh, really? That's kind of annoying again. Now, that's not going to be the same for every viewer. So how do you prevent a character from becoming too annoying? The best option, I think, is to make that character as well-rounded as possible. So when you make a character more well-rounded and we understand what their strengths and their weaknesses are, then we can kind of deal with their weaknesses knowing that we're going to see them, have a strength at some point as well. But if we're only seeing a caricature of a person, which means we're only seeing a character's weaknesses or we're only seeing a character's strengths, then I think we tend to have a harder time. It's kind of, if a character is too strong, we tend to go, man, this person wins at everything. This is ridiculous. But if a character is too weak, we can tend to go like, this character loses it. Wouldn't they learn their lesson and act a little bit differently next time? And I think for me, Willie falls too far into that side of it. We only see, in the beginning, we see some of her strengths. She's a really great performer. Every other period of the show, we're only seeing the weaknesses of Willie. And sometimes those weaknesses net out in kind of this ridiculous cartoonish action where good things happen. And sometimes it's causing problems for everybody involved in the film. The last thing I would think that we can learn from Temple of Doom, and we touched on it a little bit, and I was just listening to a podcast with a Script Apart podcast, which I highly recommend. Script Apart is a really great podcast. I think it was David Knope, or David Knope, I don't know how to pronounce his name, the writer of Jurassic Park and the writer of Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, actually. So Jurassic Park, Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, one of the best movies ever, one of the movies that people say is actually disappointing. And what he said was, sometimes audiences won't care about the information that you don't provide, and they'll just ignore it. So, for example, he gave an example where he was talking about in Jurassic Park, there's the last scene where the banner falls over the T-Rex. And he said, well, we've got to explain how the T-Rex got inside, right? And Steven Spielberg said, no, the audience will not care how this T-Rex got inside. And he goes, no, they will care. And he goes, no, they'll just see a T-Rex inside, and that will be their core focus will be on that, not how the T-Rex got inside the building. And I think that is a good lesson to be learned for when we talked about Temple of Doom and not understanding what the Sankara stones really were or how they were going to affect the world. Ultimately, does that really matter in this story? I don't think that it does. I think that in this story, what we really need to know is that Molaram is a bad guy. He's going to use the stones to do something nefarious. He's already doing something nefarious by having the child slaves working the mines, trying to find the other Sankara stones. And thus we don't need to go into this long expositionary scene about what the Sankara stones do and what the power they have. We don't ever really know that. And I think that that's okay because as Steven Spielberg was saying in Jurassic Park, sometimes what's on screen is compelling enough. If we know that Molaram is pulling the hearts out of people and we know that he's enslaving kids to work in his mines, we can say this person needs to be stopped regardless of what he intends to do with the Sankara stones. Now, we know what he intends to do because he tells Indy that in the one scene, but it's not built up like it is in Raiders of the Lost Ark, where they say, this is the Ark of the Covenant, this is what it's capable of, and this is why the Germans might want to capture that and use it nefariously. We don't get that as much of an explanation in Temple of Doom, nor do I think we really need it. So that's something too where the exposition isn't necessary because there's enough being shown to us about Molaram and the Thuggee cult that we can go, well, these are bad people and they should be stopped. So I think that's another really cool lesson to learn there as well. The other thing that I really noticed this time watching Temple of Doom is that despite the fact that it's a much sillier film, in my opinion, than Raiders, and therefore does lose me a bit. Again, I love it, so it's a 9 out of 10 for me. But Raiders is a 10 out of 10. Is that Indiana Jones as a character maintains, he rarely gets silly, if ever, in that film. And so he maintains the same type of character we saw in Raiders as he is in Temple of Doom as well. And I think that goes a long way for us to like what we see on film and go with it, as opposed to breaking out of the film, having a suspension of disbelief. If suddenly Indiana Jones himself was acting really silly and doing some really dumb jokes, then we might have to suspend our disbelief on his character at that point in time. But he doesn't do that. Harrison Ford plays it very straight the whole way through and doesn't get silly with it. Even with his relationship with Short Round, he's treating Short Round as like, yeah, of course you can drive a car really well. Of course that we can make it through this next situation. Of course this is possible for us to do. And if at any time he started to act silly and it started to be and if Harrison Ford portrayed it as being a silly thing, then I think that would take all of the audience and we'd all go, oh, this is just a silly movie then? This is a comedy of some kind? But Harrison Ford doesn't do that, nor does it seem like it's written that way, and therefore he can move forward with the performance that we get. And the audience, I think, you and I can say, that's really cool, and I can go along with it because he's not breaking character. So there you go. Those are some storytelling things that I think that we can learn from watching Temple of Doom. Let me know what you think we could learn in the comments down below. Be sure to subscribe to How Stories Work with Jay Sherer, both the YouTube channel and the podcast, and check out the Story Geeks podcast or the Story Geeks show over on Orange Grove 55's YouTube channel. As you know, too, you might have heard, we are doing a short film this year. You can help us fund that short film and learn about the cool benefits we have for people who support the short film. It is a superhero thriller, a low-budget superhero thriller focused around guilt and shame. And I think it's a really powerful message, and I would love to have you help us make that film. So check out the links below, and you can learn more about No Vacancy, our short film that we're filming later this year. And I've got some really cool things to announce pretty soon about how we're progressing with that film. So I've had some really great conversations this week. Just haven't had time to update everybody on them. Thanks for watching. Leave me your comments down below, and I will see you on the next show.